Sup, guys? The Ironblood faction has been getting ample attention lately, and it seems like everyone has been focusing on the number of ships they receive. However, I don't think the number of ships is the only issue. Despite being the OG bias faction and always having a major event in September, the IJN is actually currently in the worst spot meta-wise out of all the major factions. The entire faction has been reduced to heavy armor specialization that is outperformed by the recent Ironblood and Royal Navy offerings. In the Vanguard, they currently have a grand total of 0 ships in the S tier. While ships like Shimanto and Kazagumo are quite solid and can find a lot of use, they're by no means irreplaceable. For battleships, they still only have Musashi, who is relegated to being a defensive campaign specialist, since her restriction of having to use subpar IJN main guns completely crushes any hope of her competing against other battleships against bosses. The carrier department is the only place where they still have some relevance due to their heavy torpedo bomber specialization. Historically, they have been the premier faction for dealing with heavy armor, spearheaded by Shinano, who, up until this point, has been the UR with the greatest longevity. Ironically, on release, I remember there being a lot of people who thought that she wasn't even that much better than the existing ships, and placed her around the level of existing SSRs. Her longevity is driven not only by her top-of-the-line damage at the time of her release, but also to this day some of the strongest buffs in the game, particularly for IJN carriers, providing over 30% damage to already powerful carriers like Amagi and Hakuryu. Hakuhou, on the other hand, was taken in the completely opposite direction, providing no support to the rest of the fleet and instead demanding that your fleet be built around her just to enable her kit. While she is quite powerful when fully enabled, the main issue is that the reward is not worth the amount of hoops you have to jump through to achieve it. Not too long ago, I was curious about whether Shinano or Amagi would actually be the better pairing with Hakuhou, and what I stumbled upon was a bit of bad news for Hakuhou. In this series of tests, I looked to compare the damage outputs of the IJN carriers when used as duos instead of altogether. There were a bunch of times when I tested Hakuhou without using an IJN plane in her first slot to activate her buff, because that's just how little I've used her. I have finally remembered to do it this time. Implacable is used in the main fleet as a non-IJN ship that keeps the boss still, so we can be sure that the hit rate is consistent. Kashino is used in the Vanguard just to have a third IJN ship for Shinano's requirement, while dealing as little damage as possible. She doesn't have any cargo auxiliaries equipped, so she doesn't provide any buffs to the other ships in the fleet. Finally, Eldridge is used to make sure the Vanguard stays alive consistently. Also, if the timing with Implacable isn't ideal, Eldridge's slow should make sure everything still lands. Looking at the results, first, let's compare using Amagi and Shinano as partners for Hakuhou using a typical loadout. As expected, Shinano's buffs are stronger than Amagi's, while her own damage is lower. What I didn't expect though was for Shinano and Hakuhou's total damage to be higher, and Amagi's personal damage wasn't ahead by that big of a margin. Looking back, a lot of the times when Shinano seemed like she was dealing much less damage than other carriers was due to the fact that she gets revealed much easier than other carriers. In this test, where none of the carriers were revealed, Shinano was actually closer to Amagi than I expected. Some other nuances to consider is that Shinano's buffs and debuffs will most likely benefit the other ships in the fleet more than Amagi in a lot of situations, so any battleships, non-IJN carriers, and vanguards will prefer Shinano over Amagi. On the other hand, Amagi benefits from having more IJN ships in the fleet, increasing their torpedo damage and also firing off more of her Phoenix Flame barrage, although that is a very minor part of her total damage output. The combined damage between the two sets is really close, so I won't say that using Shinano will always result in more damage than Amagi, but this did change my opinion about who should be the higher rated ship. Now, here is the actual most surprising find. Not using Hakuhou, and instead just going with the old duo of Amagi and Shinano, actually results in similar damage, within 5% of using Hakuhou. On top of barely providing more damage, Hakuhou also provides no fleet support, unlike Amagi and Shinano. At that point, it's hard to justify using Hakuhou at all with only one other IJN carrier. There is just one last thing to consider, which is that Hakuhou could potentially be better in 4-strike setups relative to Amagi and Shinano. A lot of her damage comes from her insanely strong torpedo bomber barrage, which only activates 2 out of 3 times for the first 3 airstrikes when she only has one IJN partner. For 4 strikes, it activates 3 out of 4 times instead, going from 2/3 of the time to 3/4, plus the extra airstrike at the cost of using weaker planes. Putting the theory to the test, indeed Hakuhou does deal slightly more damage doing 4 airstrikes instead of 3, but Amagi or Shinano would deal less since they don't get as much of a boost from their barrages as Hakuhou does. The combined damage ends up being about the same. I didn't bother testing Shinano because she reveals herself for 4-strike setups, and I think this illustrates the point well enough already. Keep in mind that for the current 3-strike setup, I'm using Tenrais. Once I can replace these Tenrais with the new PR9 skip bombers, which provide an average of 30% more damage over Tenrais in the dive bomber slot, I would expect that the 3-strike setups would consistently outperform the 4-strike ones. The main takeaway from this is that the IJN faction have 4 UR carriers that do essentially the same thing, that being a lot of damage against heavy armor with their torpedo bomber specialization. Hakuryu is also included because dive bombers are torpedo bombers now too. Despite being the oldest by far, Shinano still seems to be the best due to her plethora of buffs when enabled, not only for carriers but destroyers as well. As a solo carrier, it's a toss-up between Amagi or Hakuryu with the new skip bombers. The only situation where Hakuhou seems to do anything more than the others is when you already have 2 IJN main fleet ships to activate all 3 of her rotating skill effects, and the opportunity cost of building the entire fleet around her is just not worth it. Take Mecklenburg for comparison, who can output similar damage with no conditions, and only requires another Ironblood main fleet ship to get a reload buff. Given the restrictiveness of Hakuhou's kit, she really needs to be able to do more when the conditions are met. Like if she had a full route like Lexington 2, or dealt 50% more damage, or increased other IJN ships' damage by as much as Shinano, it would be a more fair comparison with the other new ships. As of now, we're 2 months short of a year since her release. Since then, the meta bosses we've had were Udachi, Yorktown, Regensburg, and Bristol. Whereas the meta bosses are designed to make the new UR look good crowd now. At this point, with all the new competitive options like Mecklenburg, Immelmann, as well as Nakimov when setup is needed, it's getting close to impossible to justify running Hakuhou in any situation. On the popularity front, although I don't have the numbers to back it up, just by the vibes I would assume that she's overshadowed by her older sister Taiho too. Hopefully, in the upcoming Japanese anniversary event, we'll get something to really enable her. Otherwise, Hakuhou might go down in history as the least used UR ship of all time.